let's get started. If anyone outside wants to come in, they should get their tea or coffee or whatever is making them happy and the drug. And you guys can ask questions, just raise your hand. I mean, I'm sort of like going on and deviating, being the deviant that I am, and deviating.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what's the eschatological position on
You don't remember, are you? It's like a trick question. I mean, the problem, obviously, that's why I understand people talk to people I know, and because you have to, like, a member to understand. Like, I was in England, and I was given some of their books. Like, you go to courses they have, and so, like, you get sort of like into it, and so they don't tell you everything. And anytime anyone keeps something hidden from you, I don't care what it is, it sounds weird to me. When there's a membership fee and/or things are kept hidden from you, be careful. But generally, from what I've been able to tell from people here is that, because it's sort of vague, because they talk about Sharia and Khilafat, but on that type of language, they speak about democracy in a very negative way, but I don't know, that's what I get from it. So it seems like they're very anti-democracy, but I think it's, for what I've seen in conversation, it's very simplistic, the argument. But a lot of their students are very well read. I mean, some I know, they study Arabic, they study, traditional Islam and stuff like that. But it's really a movement, just this idea of one ummah, one leader, and the idea of having a traditional caliph who is one man who has the executive power within the ummah.
So that's one of my questions. Is there any basis for it in traditional?
Well, the tradition.
Well,
the thing is that there are hadith about the caliph, and then there's the idea that the Prophet appointed Abu Bakr as one man, and sort of everything was sort of at the end, to a degree, invested in him. But the investiture, if you sort of think about it, Sayyidina Abu Bakr said, there are different ways it happened. There was an appointment. Well, Sayyidina Umar was elected. Umar was appointed. A committee was formed for Uthman. So you have different ways it's done. On those khulafa, you have different ways it was done. And everyone agrees that they had the title of Khalifa. So the idea of investiture, but also these men, if you look at these men in that class, that early period of Caliph, they weren't just, they were, by every definition, jurists, mujtahid imams, by our legal definition of that scholarship. If you think of the Sahaba, Umar, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, if you think of their qualifications, they were not just military leaders, the commander, over the army, over all the generals, who had a final decision on especially military issues and issues of waging war and contracting for the community's well-being of other people's. They were also jurists. They were experts of the law. They were experts of the religion when it came to all aspects of the deen. So if one wants to be, I think, realistic about, if you're talking about caliph like that, the only person who could be caliph like that would be a scholar who has other qualities, because minimally, any caliph has to have one knowledge, has to have knowledge of the sacred law. If you'll be strict about reading it that way. Some jurists have limited, the idea that if a committee, the idea of committee rule, or a committee appointing a person as an executive is there in the tradition when Sayyidina Omar appointed a committee to rule, to pick a member from of the committee to be the next successor. So, very, I'm not detail at all in any way, but those are the general models that have been put forward. We also have to understand that every model put forward was a model that was pretty much standard of one-man rule of the world at the time. if you think about it, whether you were a king or you're a caliph, the idea of investing one person with rule was sort of like highest power in certain areas of government activity, of governance, so to say, has been very much part and parcel there in medieval, pre-modern forms of government, whether it's Muslims or not. In the modern realm, in the modern world, obviously, we have this idea of power, but limited power. Constitutional government is where government, you may have an executive branch, but it has limited power. It doesn't have absolute power. And the government of checks and balances is very important. I would think in our time, that would be very important. Because we see among Muslims in general, we see on many levels of Muslim communities a lot of corruption. Corruption is a very common problem in the world today. It happens here in the United States, and it happens a lot in places where, not outside the United States. In the United States, is a rather civil society on many levels. But corruption, the idea of having a system where you have checks and balances, where no person has such high investiture of power, I think, is a very wise thing. So I don't know. I mean, my talking with with members of people talk to you is that when you try to have that conversation on a very base level, it's a very simple conversation, because the idea of one man caliph and no nation states. And I find it very mind-boggling. How could you centralize authority over, continents? We've never had any type of government in human history where one person or one governing body ruled over that large a geographical area. I'm not saying it's not possible. I mean, maybe technology is possible.
Just talking to his Bukhari, I get the idea that, they seem very modern and very cosmopolitan, but it seems to me like there's a lot of brainwashing, and they seem to be...
I'm brainwashing.
I don't know, it's like almost unthinking instrument.
Well, I mean, that's why I said, when I was in Bradford, I was approached by people to join them. And they gave me some books to read, and you kind of like brought into it. So anytime I think that someone comes to you and they have to lead you in to, first you read these things, then we'll do some meetings. I mean, that sounds like,
political party.
A party or a cult or something. Anytime you see something like that, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, I just thought, when I see something that's just really, they take stands against, political oppression, there's our protests in Sydney this week against Syria and all that. Those are great things, we should protest and stuff, but waving let-off flags, black and white flags and caliph and khilafah, like that, we've never had that going on like that. Think about that. I mean, I don't know how you could practically do that. And And how could you actually, establish some? How could you maintain that? How could a caliphate actually, with the problems of the world today, with resource management and all the wealth distribution issues, give equivalence to people? I mean, it sounds nice and theoretical. You can easily draw a map of the world with Khalifa on it. That's so simple to do. Blanket all in. This is the caliphate, and that's our up there in Iceland. We'll get there. But and if most people who remember that, are all these kids. I mean, once they get married, they turn 28, they all drop out of the organization. As soon as they get married, and their wife kicks them around, and they go shopping and push baby buggies. They give up all the protesting and stuff like that. And when they get married, no one ends up divorces. That always find a better. Yeah.
I was wondering, from a movement like within Islamic community, is that more of like a 19th and 20th century phenomenon?
Yeah, I think that's more of a modernist thing. Modern being in the past 200 or 300 years, this type of movement. Let's not talk about it now. I got to go on. I'm sorry, but I'm actually going to Toronto first weekend of March. And we've shifted it back, and I'm going to spend 2 days like today. There's like a day like this, and then the next day talking about modern ideological movements in Islamic history, how they affect Western Muslims. I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to talk about the rise of the Salafiyya and Abdul Wahab and the reform movement in the subcontinent, and then talk about Sayyid Qutb, and talk about Abdul and Al-Dudi, and then talk about Al-Qaeda and then the jihad moves that formed, and in Side Nursi group from Turkey, any group I can think of, like, Muhajirun, small groups, talk about them all in 2 days, because basically it is any group you run into living in the West. What are the main groups you can bump into at the masjid or at the MSA, membership, fund drive, whatever.
Will that be
And it'll be in Toronto. I don't know if we're going to record it or not, but I'm going to have to start preparing for that tomorrow. I leave this and move on to another set of, hey, Ali, where are you for more PowerPoints? Yeah, another all-nighter before I leave. I've got 4 weeks to get it done, so. Rashad, get your Fondren Library card out. More books.
Wait, quick announcement?
Yeah.
I handed the feedback flyer or paper. You can fill it out, and then I'm going to hand it to Shaykh Naeem, just fold it in half, and he told me he was going to read it.
What is that?
For feedback?
Yeah, give me your feedback. Always only say good things. I am not neutral on positions, as you probably figured out today. So I make that quite clear. I'm just, I'm an old man. I have a right to have my positions. Jihad Kital Harb. Ooh. So I want to talk about a little bit about, I don't want to go on to, jihad, jihad of the nafs and, all those things. You've all heard about jihad, okay? And I mean, if I ask you about those things, you'd probably be able to answer a lot of questions correctly on issues of jihad. So I don't really want to get into like your standard jihad discussion. I mean, I think we've had a lot of those. The first thing is that the Quran acknowledges conflict, that conflict will exist between people. And the idea of daf, or pushing back or preventing conflict, is a part and parcel of reality. So let's accept that. It can happen within the house of Islam and outside the house of Islam. And even to use that language, it's very medieval. Dar al-Islam or outside the Dar of Islam, the realm of Islam. And there are certain verbs, the verb jahada, qatala, and haraba are the verbs that you find that imply either conflict, warfare, or fighting, or killing. Okay? If you want to use those words. When I get to the discussion by Ramadan al-Bhuti, it'll help to maybe clear up some stuff. وَقَاتْلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا. Can you read that? وَلَا تَعْعَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Allah is warning us that when you, and one thing you should understand, this is what Ramadan al-Bhuti was going to bring up, is that this usage in the Quran of this word is important how it is. Qatala. Okay? That verb. And so that's the predominant way you see the verb is go. So when you fight in the path of God, those who fight you do not i'tada is to exceed a limit. Don't be excessive. So there's even the idea of restraint in warfare, in fighting. And that's something we should keep in mind. لَا تُقَاتِلُوا قَوْمًا نَكَثُوا أَيْمَانَهُمْ. Allah, will you not fight those who nakathu, they break their covenant, which we will get to on that one, Surah Tawbah, I believe also. And this verse, لَيَسْتَأْذِنُكَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِاللَّهِ وَالْيَوْمِ الْآخِرِ أَنْ يُجَاهِدُوا بِأَمْوَالِهِمْ. And this is the verse where Muslims were given after the Hijrah the permission from Allah to defend themselves, to make this jihad. So here the verb jihad, or effort, struggle, is implied. So these are some of the verses. So the Quran doesn't, deny that these things happen, but we have to talk about this verb qatala here and jahada, because both of those verbs are the morpheme, the morphological pattern is important, and that's what Imam Abdul is going to show us. ولو شئنا لبعثنا في كل قرية نذيرا فلا تطيعوا كافرين وجاهدهم به جهادا كبيرا. So we know that Allah Ta'ala could, have brought forth prophets at all times and places. But Allah is, again, encouraging us to make this jihad, which we will get into. Actually, it's on, I have it on my computer. It's this, I wish it was translated to English, this Kitab al-Jihad, how is it done and how is it implemented by Imam Abdul, because it's a really nice analysis of jihad in many aspects, answering a lot of questions. There in verse Ankabut. So one thing about these, which I have up here, these verses are Meccan verses. These Meccan verses, when we talk about jihad, are not conflict verses. They're verses that deal with is that Muslims are making an effort and struggle against the people, but not in a defensive manner or offensive manner that requires physical conflict. So they're new. It doesn't imply that. So that's why I put these Meccan verses there, which you could have found these anyway. The Meccan verses that reference jihad here in Ankabut and sort of Nahl also these verses. And most scholars, when you read the commentary of these, are the Muslims who were steadfast in their religion, and they did da'wah. They were calling to. So the idea of being steadfast in the religion under a persecution, to call people towards Tawheed, the affirmation of Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, this da'wah is an overarching concept of jihad, implicit within the Quranic text. That's why, which I wasn't able to do this whole discussion. I have some different books I got in Arabic as PDFs. I had a brother send them to me from Saudi Arabia. Figured it was a good place to get books on jihad. And so he sent me a lot of good books on jihad. I guess it's like the corner jihad bookstore. And next to the niqab shop. And other things. I had some strange things happen to me in Saudi Arabia. Anyway. And so, one was class of books on the Fada'il of Jihad and the Adab of Jihad. I love those books, about Adab, how to slay properly and all that. But the one book that was important was the Imam Abdul book. There was another book by one of the Sheikhs of Azhar, but I think what Bhuti had given a much more thorough analysis of jihad, as he does, and anything he produces is very thorough. But one jihad, which we have, I think Omar for typing it up here, where a man asked the Prophet, "Ujahid ajahadu qalaka it should be abwana anwan. I have that. My handwriting. قال نعم قال ففيهما فجاهد. The man asked the Prophet going on jihad at Ghazwa, the Prophet said, "You have your parents?" He said, "Yes." He said, "Then you're ففيهما فجاهد. In these two, make your effort." Well, the jihad, that was the jihad of serving the parents. And that's what this hadith is about. The point being is that jihad was used by the Prophet in different contexts. Even for one man, his jihad was not to go in Ghazwa, but was actually, he was getting the reward of jihad just to serve his parents. So, and I think you all understand that. This is not something you would find unusual. You're all, I think, familiar with these ideas. As for qatala, since jihad has this broad meaning, it can mean military conflict, it can be defensive, offensive, it can just be serving one's parents, it can be against your own self. He has multiple layers, and we understand that. And so, as I said, none of us finds that unusual. But qatala, though, might be slightly different in usage. يُحِبُّ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَ فِي سَبِيلِهِ صَفًّا كَأَنَّهُمْ بُنْيَانٌ مَرْصُوصٌ. Allah loves those who fight. Now, so we'll get to here, but qatala is a specific meaning. It doesn't mean kill, it means fight. So keep that in mind. وَيُقَاتِلْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ, let those who الَّذِينَ يَشْعُرُونَ حَيَاةَ الدُّنْيَا وَالْآخِرَةِ. I'm going to do that. Well, that's a Pepsi break for me. I'm Mujahidu Pepsi right now. I'm destroying it. What happened? We were defeated by technology. Okay, so that's fine. Let me go ahead. Hold on. Is it coming? Okay. Hold off on that. Oh, so I will now do something else to entertain the audience. This. That's fine. So that's why here. So, hello, Mohammed. Doing the camera thing. What I want to do now, while we're waiting for our technician, is I want to look at this discussion by Ramamuti about the hadith. I mentioned to you that there was a verse in the Quran. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In Surah At-Tawbah, فإذا انسلخ أشهر حرم فاقتلوا مشركين حيث وجدتموهم وخذوهم واحصروهم واقعدوا لهم كل مرصد إن تابوا وأقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وخلوا سبيلهم إن الله غفور رحيم. This is the ayat, the sayf, the verse of the sword, which you'll hear about from jihad online and also Mujahid. I love Mujahideen online and .com and jihadwatch.com, .org, and this is the evil verse that is the sword hanging over Western civilization, right here. And it's the verse that those who say, Muslim scholars, that it has abrogated any other verse before it when it comes to having peaceful relations to people who aren't Muslim. So now that we're back on up there, I either continue with this and come back to that. What are we going to do?
Just finish this one.
Give me fishes. That's called deference. I'm a mujtahid, I make my decisions. Thank you for your, I consulted you, your consultation was found weak and unacceptable. Fiqh in action, that's right. So, fiction in action. One man's fiqh is another man's fiction. Now that would be a good t-shirt right there. There we go. I'll get in my t-shirt mode and bumper stickers. I have a bunch of them. So there, the word qatala, and then the word haraba, إِنَّمَا جَزَاءُ الَّذِينَ يُحَارِبُونَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ وَيَسْعُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا. And then the verse, in the penalty of those who wage war. The idea of haraba, war. Okay? This is in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 33. There you go. So, war does exist. Without getting too much commentary about this, by the way. Okay? This is not the point. I just want to show that these verbs, these verbs in the Quran. But then I asked the question, Dar al-Harb. That's a big question. Dar al-Harb. Why do I have it like that? Okay. One question we asked is this Dar al-Harb, and when you read the texts on jihad and these issues, there's Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Aman, and so you have all these different realms. It's like a chess game almost. And of course, the early classical scholars, no one talked about Dar al-Harb. This was not like a term. It became a term. And really, it's nothing unusual, first of all, to think of regions. Remember, in medieval Islam, early Islam, and then in the up to the modern period of nation states, borders were very fluid. And border zones, the concept of the ribat, the outposts, the border regions where there's a land over here where Muslims have some type of control over, and there's a land over there where some Muslim authority isn't in control. That became in the language of the jurists and etc. the language of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the realm of Islam, the realm of warfare. And obviously then the scholars who, when they spoke about this, it becomes more and more, it became refined in the discussions. There might be a land, where it wasn't actually hard per se, but it was a land of truce or a land of security, aman. And I think I have some notes here on that someplace. So, for example, in the language of the Dar al-Harb, there was Dar al-Khawf versus Dar al-Aman. So, if it was a land where non-Muslims were, or there was no control by Muslim authority, was it a safe place? That was Dar al-Aman. Was there a treaty with those people? If not, and was it a place where a Muslim could have either threat to his property or threat to his person? Well, that was Dar al-Harb in a sense where there was khawf, there was fear in it. And the Muslims then, when the scholars start discussing this, then once they discuss it, then the questions come, well, then what makes it that? By definition. What are the things you have to have or not to have to make it Dar al-Harb to Dar al-Islam? Could it convert back to, could a Dar al-Islam be a loss and we revert back to Dar al-Harb? And so, once you define something, then you have to then give sub-definitions to it. Normal course of human endeavor on that. But for us today, as Muslims today, we need to sort of maybe step back from this classical view of things. First of all, we're not living in a realm where borders are fluid anymore. Borders are fixed. Nation states exist. This is a new phenomenon. Nation states exist. Traditionally, the Dar al-Harb was where any Muslim could live and feel safe and carry on trade and worship and be and publicly and privately. And they had this authority. They can go to a Muslim judge, and you can go from any place within that Dar, and you were safe. You can go past language zones and whatever, and be okay. That was the general idea. But obviously today, we're talking about, well, I'm in Egypt, I'm a Muslim living in Egypt, I'm an Egyptian national. I need a passport to travel over to Libya. And then another one, and then I need a visa to go there. So, it's changed now with our modern nation-state system, the contemporary system of the political entities. That Dar al-Harb versus Dar al-Islam is going to be rather hard to define in that classical approach. So, if it's a place, if you define it well as a place where a majority of Muslims live at, you can define it that way, I suppose, if you want to, by that definition. But for us in the United States, we would ask ourselves, well, if you're going to define the United States, well, what are you going to define it as? Well, some people will say, well, it's Dar al-Harb because it's the United States. And yet others will say, no, it's not, because of the fact that it's not, there's no Sharia here, there's no Islamic law here, the penalties are not applied here, and that's why. The Quran isn't the principal source of legislation, quote unquote, in that understanding. So the United States is Dar al-Harb. But that is not necessarily the definition that most scholars give. As most scholars say, Dar al-Islam is a place where any of the signs of Islam are found. So if you have a minaret, an adhan, a nikah being performed, that could definitely be Dar al-Islam. Because one of the isharat signs of Islam exist there. And once it exists there, it default becomes that way. So it's a rather term that, maybe it's a term we don't need to be using much anymore today. It's a term which of its time may have had its place in the worldviews that were shared in some way of its time. Today, it would be rather difficult for us to do that, I think. That's what I wanted to say about that. Honestly, if it was about security of person and wealth and property and religion, I feel safer here. I'm sure I would feel worried. I think if I lived in Afghanistan, I would fear about my wealth, I would fear about my body. Anytime. A sense of security, I have more security here, I think. So if that was your definition, and that is one definition, where those things are preserved, and of course that's what a maqasid sharia is, in a sense, preserving your body, preserving your wealth, your life, your religion. For many Muslims, you get more of that where you're a minority than where you're a majority. So we can have, a tit for tat in how we define that, I think, in our contemporary situation. So that was one point I wanted to bring up. And, there's a lot of reading about that, obviously, there's always a lot of reading about everything. Someone's doing a PhD on this somewhere, I'm sure, right now. And this is another verse to the mind that, because I'm running out of time, I need to sort of I had this bit of, statistics up here, but what we noticed is that when the Prophet ﷺ was on Ghazwa with his companions, you had less loss of life than when he wasn't. Maybe it was a blessing of him being around, that was his physical presence was a blessing for people, that violence was, even in conflict of warfare, was reduced, subhanAllah. But if you sort of look at the numbers, that's what you'll come to, that understanding. Ali originally had some pie charts. I thought it was really weird. No, they were nice pie charts. It was like, they could be sort of deceptive, I thought, in what it was saying. So I told him to take down the pie charts, but he did a lot of work on them, but I said delete them. So anyway. But what I want to talk about is the hadith here, this hadith. This is what Naeem was talking about. The hadith is, I have been ordered to fight by God, to fight against the people until they test that there is no right to worship but Allah, and that Muhammad is his apostle, his messenger, and offers the prayers perfectly and obligatory charity. They perform them, and that they save their lives and their property from me except for Islamic laws. Then their reckoning accounts will be done by Allah. It's just some of the wordings of the hadith. I'm actually tired. I'm going to get through this today. Bismillah. Pepsi, jihad, focus. Well, the hadith, my translation. I've been commanded to fight people until they witness that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. That they establish ritual prayer and pay zakat. If they have done this, they have freed themselves. Awesome, they are safe with me. What saved them? Their blood, their wealth, except by the rights of Islam, and their judgment. Their judgment is with God. This is maybe 9's translation. This is the primary hadith after the verse number 9 of Surah At-Tawbah about after the 4 months have passed, slay them wherever you find them. And that these two textual evidences abrogate any relationship with non-Muslims. And this is one which will get a lot of the Islamophobic people citing, with at the same time quoting from juridical texts to support it. Because you will find jurists who write these texts supporting such a view, because it is a position. Okay, what I want to present is that there are weaknesses in that position. And I want to use Ramadan al-Houthi in his work here, in this section of his book, Jihad fi Islam, on that. I don't have an English translation of it. Sorry, but it's just, I didn't have time to translate it for you in English. You'll have to take my word for it as I'm going through it. So he mentions in the book, how yushkilu an hadha hadith, is there a problem with this hadith? he's been talking about that the most important da'wah is jihad, is a jihad of da'wah. He doesn't deny that there is a jihad of military usage of the word, the martial tradition of jihad. He's not denying that. But he's saying what takes precedent. So Bhuti has already argued a case that the most important thing is making da'wah to people. Now that's not unusual, by the way, of contemporary jurists in the context of jihad, by the way. Okay? Some might read it as sort of like a cop-out type of fatwa in order to neutralize the martial military tradition, in order to placate people who would see this apparently aggressiveness of the religion. I don't deny that that's possible and even true, but nevertheless, his analysis, if you ever read it, if you ever have access to read the English translations or the original Arabic of Rawal Bhuti's juridical works, you'll find that they're very worked out reasoned arguments. Of course, many jurists aren't, but for a contemporary jurist, he works out things very well. He works out good arguments, and he does a lot of analysis, and that's why I think that he has important things to say. But there was something else. Yes. But before I do that, I want to talk about, and I mentioned this, and this is my note here, two things I think I have to share with you. Is that when I mentioned to you before, the problem of Islam, this is what I want, this is what I want us to keep in mind in whatever the discussion here. Maybe we keep in mind what we would say Rawal Bhuti when he's talking, or what I'm saying. I'm really nobody, but is to understand these 2 points. 2 points here. The Prophet ﷺ was aware of the Munafiqun of Medina. And the Munafiqun were a threat. They were troublemakers. Their example was not to go to Medina with the Prophet. They were a community that resisted the call to go fi sabilillah. They were praying with the Muslims, but they when it came to doing the work of that type of work, they stepped out of the group. And so that's a very bad example, because what they're doing is that they're stepping out of following the Prophet in a sense. They were lax in their religion. So when it came to just the practice, they were lax. Yusahiluna. They were lazy in the religion. So they were also a bad example for that. They were discouraged when the Prophet, his example was to get night, make hajj, and to strive for religion. They were, coming to the prayers late. They're really dying and always finding excuses to minimize the religion. Of course, and that would have been very, counterproductive for this new religion. So we can see that the Munafiqun overall were problematic people. And the Prophet knew this. He knew this thing very well, because the Quran itself was talking about the Munafiqun. And the companions themselves were picking up on who these people were. But what's interesting is that the hadith of the Prophet, when he was requested, well, why don't you do something about these people? And he said, let it not be said that people would say that Muhammad killed his followers. But why is that important? Because the Prophet at that time was thinking, he knew these people internally were seriously problematic for the religion. But he knew that if he did anything to touch them physically, because they said that they were Muslim, because they were officially Muslim in the community, he would be said in the future that he killed his own followers. So he was thinking of the outcome of such an action, where he would take people, how they would judge him. Okay? When Sayyidina Aisha when he spoke about the Kaaba and the original dimensions of the Kaaba. And he could have torn down the Kaaba and put it on its original foundation. But he didn't do that. And why did he do it? Because he feared the people then would turn away from him. Because the Arabs already, the people of Mecca and the people of Mecca already had understanding that's how the Kaaba is. Don't fiddle with it. But he knew as a prophet, its size was like this. And he told this to Aisha, I would tear it down and rebuild it on its original foundation, but that the people would turn away if I did that. He thought of the outcome of that act. He could have restored the Kaaba to the Abrahamic dimensions, but he didn't. Because of what? That act at that time would have been counterproductive towards Islam itself, towards the community. These two examples from the seerah of the Prophet are really important for us. We must think of the outcomes that can be detrimental as people perceive us, as persons, as the Prophet himself, and could turn them away from the religion. And the choices that we make when it comes to dealing with the expression of this religion and how we do things. So keep that in mind. Another thing is about the fixed punishments. Is that there's a hadith that is not found in any of the six texts, the six canonical collections of hadith, Kutub Sitta. And it's the hadith from Aisha. You'll find it in Tirmidhi as a weak hadith. Therefore, if it's weak in Tirmidhi, it's going to be rejected by some people. But it's a pivotal hadith in the issue of the hard punishments, the penalties. The Prophet said, "Idra'u hudud al-muslimin ma istata'tum in kana lahu makhrajun fakhalu sabilahu فإن الإمام إن يخطئ في عفو خير من أن يخطئ في عقوبة." He said, divert or impede the fixed penalties, the had, the hudud, cutting off the hand, whatever it may be, from the Muslims, as much as you are capable. And seek a means out. No. But if there's a means out, a makhraj, open it up. Fakhalas will open up the path. If you can divert or turn that person away from being penalized, from being punished, do it. Find a way out. It's better for the imam to make a mistake in forgiveness than to make a mistake in applying a penalty. If you have to make a mistake, this is a Sahih hadith. This is the Sahih version. And I think it's narrated by Ibn Abi Shayba in his collection. The point is, don't find out. So, if you only limit yourself to the 6 books of hadith, you would have never known this hadith in an authentic form. You would have, if it was weak, you may not use it in order to use it as a principle for a hukm. But if it's authentic, you can use it. It has greater strength. Now, the reason I'm telling this hadith is because this is one that many jurists have used in the past, but a lot of students or gung-ho Muslims have never heard of or even think about. That you try to avoid the penalties, not to seek them. It's the same thing as you try to avoid your adversary. You don't look to go to war. But when you go to war, you don't turn your back. But you don't seek it out. Okay? So as Muslims, we should want to try to avert harm, even if it's a penalty of God. Find a way, a makhraj, if you can. The second narration is from Sayyidina Umar. He said, لأن أعتل الحدود بالشبهات أحب إلي من أن أقيمها في الشبهات. It's more beloved to me to turn away the penalties, the hudud, by something of doubt, than to establish it in doubt. But if there's a penalty and I can find it, there's doubt, and I would rather turn it away. I like doing that more than applying the penalty. This is what we need to understand, because we can't just have people screaming and saying cut off hands and do this and do that and all these things. Because this is not our way. It's not prophetic religion. That's violence. There is violence in the real world, and prophetic religion has an aspect of violence to it. Those penalties are harsh, but you try to avoid them as best you can. That's what a judge should do. And that's just advice to judge. It's not, vigilantism is not Islam. The only time I can think of when you're allowed to take things into your own hand would be definitely if you're invaded, if you're physically under threat at that time, physically under threat. Your home is invaded, or your neighborhood, or your land, and you're under real threat. You don't need someone's permission then. It's like American law. If someone breaks into your home and you feel threatened, you're allowed to shoot them. Was that woman in Oklahoma shot that man? Came to and shot him dead. Breaking into her trailer, right? And she's not being tried because that's understood in this country too. You want to try to break in? You got a shotgun? Well, take a mess. We have a lot of guns in the country. If someone breaks in, use it. The point is, I'd forgotten about these and I thought I should bring them up. Okay. So Rambam Bhutti then, he's saying, this hadith what about this hadith? Because it seems to be problematic for us. It seems to be telling us to go out and fight people until they say La ilaha illallah. And it's when it's cited. Okay. The first thing he says is that this hadith, هذا hadith غريب الإسناد. First of all, he says this hadith has an unusual sentence to it. It's gharib. Okay? Even though Imams Bukhari and Muslim have authenticated it, he says it's interesting, you do not find this hadith at all in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad. And he says, especially he said, على توسعه وتسهيله في رواية صحيح وغيره, and that he was much more lenient in putting in hadith into his musnad, his collection of hadith. You don't find Imam Ahmad in quoting this hadith. Okay? So he says here, that's 32, 33, 34, I'm on the wrong page. So he says, number 1, let's see, it's page 32, 33. Oh, there it is. Yeah, I got my number. Here, I'm all right now. Here we go. That's the first thing he mentions. The second thing he mentions is this. Is that Ibn Umar narrates this from his father, Umar, this hadith. Or Ibn Umar knows this hadith. He asks this question, why wasn't this hadith known to Sayyidina Umar when Sayyidina Abu Bakr quoted it to him about the issue of the people who would pay zakat when he was caliph? But his son knew about it, Ibn Umar. But the father didn't know about it. He finds it very strange. So Ibn Umar is narrating it from the Prophet, but Umar, his father, doesn't even know this hadith. Yet Abu Bakr knows it. And Ibn Umar knows it. How come Umar didn't know it? He finds that very strange. Especially something which is so pivotal, a very powerful hadith. And that was the evidence that Abu Bakr cited to Umar why he should fight the people who would pay zakat to the zakat collectors that were sent out by the Prophet when he passes away. The same people are sent out and they won't pay zakat.
So is it generally the case that Hazrat Umar would know about that?
So say, Rambam Bhutti is saying, isn't it strange that you would think Umar knows it, Ibn Umar knows it, his son, Abu Bakr knows it, but yet Umar didn't know this after all those years? He didn't know this? You would think he would have known it. So he finds it strange, that's a strange thing. But he says, nevertheless, both Bukhari and Muslim have said it's authentic, so we have these questions, but he says, غير أن هذا الذي لا يقوي على تعديل الحديث. He said, even with that, this is not an evidence to weaken the hadith though. I have reservations, but those are question marks about it. But nevertheless, they exist, but still Bukhari and Muslim authenticated. So we have to see to that. This is what he's saying so far. He says, كما أن العدم وجوده في مسند أحمد لا يخلل بسهده. Even that it's not, just because it's not found in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, that doesn't affect its authenticity. And even though it's gharib, even Hafiz ibn Hajar still has a large discussion on its authenticity. So, that's there. So he says, even therefore, when we discuss that point, you all falling asleep yet? Okay, wake up, it's time again, time to comprehend. I'll start with fingertips. You laugh, man. فكيف يمكن فهم هذا الحديث على ذا ما قلنا? How can we understand this hadith then? What we previously discussed. من أن دعوة الإسلام يجب على أن تتم في تطاق اختيار وحرية اتخاذ القرار. He said, how can we understand this hadith? It seems to imply some type of compulsion upon people when we already had this discussion that clearly shows that there is ikhtiyar, choice, and freedom in choosing the of Islam. He's already established in the book. It's a big, thick book, by the way. He's already established evidence that you must have choice to choose Islam. You can't be forced, right? La ikraha fi din, in other verses of the Quran. So he says, I will give some understandings on this, so you understand. The first understanding of this hadith, and it's the weak position of this hadith, in a sense of compulsion towards Islam. عن دعوة الناس إلى الإسلام عن توعيات ودون إلزام إنما كانت في صدر الإسلام أي قابل مشروعية الجهاد كتعالي. ثم إن هذا حكم نسخ فيما بعد بآيات سيف وبهذا الحديث. One position is this, is that any discussion about Islam being a free choice, it existed once. But with the descent with this hadith and with this statement of the Prophet and from Surah Tawbah, verse number 9, or verse number 5, in Surah Tawbah, has abrogated it. That is one position. And he says this is a weak position. And so this is a position that some people have about the fact that a person can be forced into Islam. He says this is a position, it exists, but he says it is the weakest of them. He says the second opinion, وبه قال أكثر الفقهاء والمفسرين, is what most ulama and mufassirun, that is ulama and exegetes of the Quran, say. And the hukm of free choice towards Islam, back it remains. It's there. والآيات التي تدل على دعوة الإسلام دون إكراه محكمة وليست منسوخة. That the verses of the Quran that indicate there should no compulsion towards Islam and believing are still legally in place and have not been abrogated. And they say that this hadith Ibn Omar does not contradict that position. Even though it seems like it contradicts it, it doesn't actually contradict it. But he said, among these who hold this position, the second opinion, there are two groups. In Qasm ila firqain, there are two groups. The first group, they say that the word nas here, the word nas is lafz am in Arabic. It is a general statement. It means people. It's not qualified. Ya ayyuhan nas, O mankind. It's not the same as ya ayyuhan aman, or you believe. Or you believe is qualified. أو يوم الناس unqualified. Okay? That the people who were nasir, whom وَالثِّنِّيُّونَ, they are the idolaters. من وَمَنْ فِي حُكْمِهِمْ كَمُلَاهِدَ, and they are the same as atheists, mulahid. Okay? وَأَمَّا مَنْ عَدَاهُمْ فَهُمْ مَنِيُّونَ أَصْلًا. And other than idolaters, anyone else is under the rubric of choice. So there are those who say that the verses, the evidence that there is choice does exist. Among those there are two positions. One position, the choice exists but not for idolaters. Okay? But for other people. That is a sub-position within the second, right, in the second position. Allah says in the Quran, لا إكراه في الدين ولا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين. Allah says, there is no compulsion in religion. And Allah says, Allah does not forbid you in regards to those who do not fight you in regards to religion. In Surah Mumtahina, verse number 8. And he says there are many other evidences supporting this, that there is no compulsion. As for the second position, the second of the two positions within the second group, that is, there must be no compulsion in religion. Of course, the first group is saying what? Yes, there is compulsion. You fight of those who are mushrikun, or idolaters. Anyone else? No. Leave them. Is that this hadith is general, is so general that he says this way in Arabic. بمعزل عن هذا الذي فهمه بعض الناس خطأ، والدعوة الإسلامية لا يجوز أن تقترن بأي إكراه لا بحق الكتابيين ولا بحق غيرهم. والأمر بقتل المشركين بقوله تعالى فاقتلوا المشركين حيث وجدتموهم إنما هو وصف هرابة فيهم لا بسبب كفرهم وكفرهم. وبه قال الإمام مالك وأصحابه وأزاوي وجميع كبير من الفقهاء. Okay, the second mission is this, that no one is to be forced. There is no force at all towards anyone. The verse of the Quran that is cited as the verse of the sword, where Allah says, فَقْتُلُوا مُشْرِكُونَ حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمُوهُم, fight them wherever you find them, is not in regards to kufr, because the other one is based upon idolatry or kufr, if you permit it. But it is a position that is based upon hiraba, warfare. It's warfare. The actual verse that people cite that is a general statement that you are allowed to fight the kuffar for whatever reason because of kufr. He's saying it's not that. That usage in the Quran is actually a usage of warfare. So that means then that he's saying the second position of the two main positions is this: no one can be forced, and when that verse of the Quran which is cited, you can use it to force. This is verse number 5 of Surah Tawbah. Is it Surah Tawbah, right? 9? It's Surah Tawbah. Don't get all confused. Has not the meaning that people think it does, as has been popularly understood. Okay. So he says here, okay, if then this is the case, he says, فَهَذِهِ أَبْرَزُ إِجْتِهَادَاتْ أَشْهَرُهَا فِي هَذَا. He said, these, what I stated, are the clear and explicit points of disagreement concerning this hadith and these positions. So now, what I want, he says, I want to now present out to you the proofs that people get for their positions. And here are their proofs. So what's the proof then? Amma al-jihad. What about the first jihad position? That is, what's the first position, everyone? The weakest one is what? It's abrogated. Okay? So what's their proof for that? Here's their proof. The first is this. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran, فَإِذَا انْسَلَخَ الْأَشْهُرُ الْحُرُمُ فَاقْتُلُوا مُشْرِكِينَ. When the sacred months have passed, فَاقْتُلُوا, kill the mushrikeen, حَيْثُ وَجَدْتُمُوهُم, wherever you find them, وَخُذُوهُم, and take of them, وَاحْصُرُوهُم, and surround them, وَقَعُوهُم, and lay siege to them, كُلُّ مَرْصَدٍ, every type of stratagem. In tabu, if they repent, وَأَقَامُوا, and establish prayer, وَأَتَوْا الزَّكَاةَ, pay zakat, وَخَلُوا سَبِيلَهُم, leave them free. In the law of Qur'an, Allah is forgiving mercy. They say this verse abrogated anything else. Okay? The second evidence is this hadith. النَّصْ وَأَثَانِي وَهَنَا نَصْ is the text wording of this hadith as it is. Because they say, إِنَّهُ صَرِيحٌ فِي مُقَاتَلَةِ النَّاسِ كُلُّهُمْ. This hadith clearly states صَرِيحٌ, to fight people, النَّاسِ, all of كُلُّهُم. And هذه المقاتلة لا تنتهي إلا إلى غاية واحدة وهي توبة. And this fight doesn't stop except the one thing, tawbah. What tawbah is that? They enter Islam. The Prophet said, what he said, I have been commanded to fight people until they bear witness. Hatta, the ghayat, until what? Hatta, until what? They bear witness that there is no God but God. That's the tawbah they make. It's becoming into Islam. These are the two evidences that people cite only to prove that all the other verses of the Quran about peaceful relationships are all abrogated. These are the only two evidences they bring, the strong ones that they bring. فهذان دليلان هما مستندون نصب حكم سابق. These two evidences abrogate the previous rulings. Right? The previous حكم سابق, the previous ruling. And what is that? وهو أمر بدعوة إلى الإسلام دون إكراه وكسر أحد الأعداء. What is the previous ruling? That you call to Islam but without compulsion and force upon people to accept it. This is the position in the Ashab al-Ishad. For those who make this ijtihad, this is their position. But he says, غير أن بوسعنا لدي تحقيق أن نجد أن أي من هذين الدليلين لا ينحضر حجة على نسخ حكم مستقر سابق في هذا المضامن. He said, with what's been presented though, there is really no strong evidence to counter our position. I mean, there really isn't a strong evidence here. He's going to now argue a case against the other position. As for the first evidence, he says, that is the verse of the law, فَإِذَا انْسَلَخَ أَشْهُرُ الْحُرُمُ, when the sacred months have passed, فغاية ما يدل عليه هو وجوب كتاب المشركين بعد انسلاخ أشهرهم، وليس ثمة خلاف على دليل الآيات على هذا القدر، ولكن هل في آيات ما يدل على موجب كتاب وكفر دون غيره؟ هذا هو another. He says the verse says when the sacred months have passed. But this doesn't. Listen what the verse says here. Look at the verse says why. The verse says, when the sacred months have passed, fight the mushrikun. All the ayat is telling you, when these sacred months are passed, fight them. But it doesn't tell you why you fight them. Do you fight them because of their conflict towards you? Do you fight them because of kufr? It doesn't say that. There's no evidence from the leading of the ayat, once those months are past, fight. Because if you look at the way the wording is, the verb is this, and when the months have passed, that's a conditional statement, fight. What happens after they pass? You fight. That's the response. You fight. But the only reason you fight is when the months have passed. That's it. That's all you're given. You are assuming it's because of something else you fight them. But if you take it literally what the text is saying, it's not saying that's what it's saying. It's a conditional statement. One leads to the next. If this, then that. So what happens? If the months pass, and when they do, you fight. So he said you can't have an explicit proof that it's because of kufr or something that you fight them. For whatever reason you may offer, he says. This is his first discussion on that. He says, والحق أن الآيات ليس فيها ما يدل أو ما يشعر بأن موجب قتال المشركين هو كفر حصرا. He says there is no proof in this evidence that indicates, as you can understand this, that it implies obligation to kill the mushrikun because of the kufr. Hasran, as an absolute proof. There's no proof of that in the wording of the text. In the ayat that tazid ala amr muslimin biqatl muslimin in the inside, all the ayat, all the verse does, it doesn't go beyond telling you after these months are passed, fight. That's all it's telling you. You can't take it beyond it. That is the. There's no more than that. Kama qulna, as we've said. وفي هذا الحال يرد احتمال كان سبب كفرا وكفر. Therefore, if that's the case, then the reason you fight it can either be of disbelief or warfare. You have a choice. Why do you fight them? Well, either fight them because they have kufr, or you fight them because they fight you. That's one option you've got. You're going to fight them, so why do you fight them? Either you fight them because they're fighting you, or you fight them because they're kafirs, and that's it. Because the ayah itself doesn't do that. You're not bound. You have to choose one of those. You got to fight them, but why do you fight them? Well, you fight them because the months are over. Well, that doesn't make any sense. There must be a better reason than that. So it's either because they're kafirs or they're hostile towards you. You don't fight one hostile towards you. And if you did, it's because of some other reason. What would that be? It must be kufr. Could be anything else. Their skin color? Maybe you could say skin color. Maybe because they're tall. But those are rather silly reasons, especially in the context of other statements you can find. So it's either kufr or harada, warfare, conflict. This is what he's saying here.
Jeff, isn't the ayah implying a perpetual warfare there?
We'll get to that. He's going to work out his argument. Okay? وكلا وصفين كان مشركون متلبسين بها لدي نزول آيات. And these two possibilities, the mushrikun already were qualified with both of them. When this verse was revealed, they were at warfare and they had shirk. So they